So let's talk about the flow of control in Ruby. Like many other programming languages, Ruby has the if and the else constructs. It also adds the else if construct, which is a short version of else if. There are no parentheses or curly braces that are used in the flow control blocks, and you use end to close flow control block. So for example, you have a variable a, which is 5. You could test, is a 3? Or else if a is 5, print out a is 5, which is what happens here, because a is 5. Ruby also has this interesting keyword called unless, which is the opposite of if. So whereas in other programming languages you would say if something is not equal to something, Ruby just has this keyword called unless. So for example, in this case, you have a is 5, and you say unless a is 3, do something, which gets printed out because a is not 3, a is 5. So these are pretty typical of a while and a till. So you have variable a equal to 10, while a is greater than 8, keep printing out a, and you're subtracting 1 from 10, and eventually a is no longer greater than 8, so you only have 10 and 9 that gets printed out, and that's it. Until is similar, so you have a, for example, equal to 9, and until a is greater than 10, keep adding 1, so you're going to print out 9 and 10, and then you're going to stop. Ruby also has this interesting form of a flow of control called the modifier form. And basically the idea is if there's no block, it's sort of like an inline version. So for example, you have variable a is 5, variable b is 0. You print out, in this case, you print out using modifier version if a is 5 and b is 0. So it reads like one sentence. Something similar you have, for example, times 2 is a variable which starts out as 2, and you could keep multiplying by 2 while times 2 is less than 100. Also very expressive. So you have a modifier form for the if and a modifier form for the while in these examples. And it ends up being that times 2 is 128 because the last variable that gets multiplied by 2 is 64, and that's when this condition is satisfied. So speaking of true and false, when something is true and something is false, in Ruby, false and nil objects are false and everything else is true. So let's see some examples here. 0 is true if 0. So in some languages, for example, JavaScript, this would be false. 0 is false. But in Ruby, 0 is actually true. Because the only things which are not true, which are false, are the actual keyword false and nil. So let's see another example. False is true if false. False in this case is a string. So false string is true. In this case, false, so this false happens to be false, right? So the false and the nil are the only two things which are false. Empty string, in some languages, empty string would be considered false. Not in Ruby. In Ruby, an empty string is absolutely true. And nil string is also true. And the nil object is going to be false. Ruby does have a for loop, but it is hardly used. The things which are used much more often are the each and the times methods, which will be covered later. So this is a very interesting construct in Ruby called blocks. It's hard to explain, but I wanted to show it to you guys up front early on in the course, so that you get used to it, and then the more you use them, the more you see them being used, you'll get used to it more and it will make more sense. So basically, blocks are just chunks of code which are enclosed between either braces or the keywords do and end, and they are passed to the methods as the last parameter, right? So you have a method which we'll explain methods in a minute, or methods or functions. But you have a method, and you could pass in a block to a method as the last parameter. So it's not really a parameter, because method and function could take their own parameters, but as the last thing or the last parameter you pass to a method is this thing you could pass in, which is called a block. And the convention is you use the curly braces when the block content is a single line, and you use do and end when the block content spans multiple lines. So let's see an example. For example, you could have one which is an object, and one has a method called times. So one.times, you're calling the method times on the one object, and you could pass in the block. And in this case, block could be whatever you want it to be. So in this case, it puts hello world. And that is how we achieved that example that I was showing much earlier in the course about how Ruby is so expressive, because times is actually a method on a instance of one. You could also have the same times and the block being passed in as a do and an end, right? So in this case, it was a curly braces, and in this case, you're actually doing do and end to pass in a block to the times method. And a lot of times, blocks could take their own variables. So for example, in this case, the block can have a variable called index. And the way you pass variables into blocks is with these pipes. They're surrounded by pipes. And in this case, what you could do is, not only can you pass in a block to the times method, inside the block you could also test for this index variable. If index is greater than 0, then print out index. If not, don't print it out. So in the case of 2 times, because index starts out as being 0, so if it's greater than 0, it will print out 1. So it's going to loop 2 times, because that's what this method does. It says execute block 2 times, but it's only going to print out 1 because of this variable index. And this is exactly the same example, but using the curly brace syntax instead of using the do and syntax. So you have 2 times, index puts index if index is greater than 0, and that ends up being the same thing. Okay, so speaking of methods and functions, parentheses are optional, like most other things in Ruby. And on empty parameter methods, you should always leave parentheses out when defining and when calling a method. And we'll see an example of that. Return in a method is optional. And if you don't pass the return, if you don't actually specify return, the value of the last executed line is returned. Another interesting thing in Ruby is that because Ruby is so expressive, you could have method names that have a question mark in them, or that have an exclamation mark in them. So let's see an example. So for example, you could have a method. So this is how you define a method. It's a def and the end, and then the method name. So in this case, the method name is 5, and the parameter is n. And it has a question because it's actually called a predicate method, right? The method is asking a question. Is this thing that I'm passing into it a 5? And if it's 5, it's true, and there's no return needed because n equals 5 is automatically evaluated to true or not, true or false, and that is what's returned. So puts 5 on a 5 is going to be true, puts 5 on a 3 is going to be false. And parentheses is optional, so you could either not have parentheses when you call a method, or you could have parentheses, it doesn't really matter. Let's see a more complicated example. Let's say a factorial method. So you pass in some number, and if that number is 0, then return a 1. Otherwise, return n times the factorial of n minus 1. So again, there's no return. You don't need it. And this is how this method works. Factorial of 5 will give you 120. And this is how it's written. You don't need a return. Now, you could also have a default value. So for example, if you don't pass anything into it, it will return a 0. So in this case, factorial of a default value, since you're not passing any parameters in, will automatically take in a 0, and n equals 0 is going to be 1. So that's what this method returns. If you don't pass any parameters in, it will return a 1. And again, these are just other examples. You could have parentheses, you could pass them in, or you could not pass them in, doesn't really matter.